My name is Naomi Mercer. I am 32 years old, and 4 years ago, my mother looked me in the eye and called my college graduation a failure ceremony. Not a milestone. Not an achievement. A failure ceremony. She said it the way someone comments on weather, calm and indifferent, as if she were not dismissing the hardest years of my life. I had earned that degree without family money, without family support, and without family pride. I walked across that stage knowing exactly which seats would be empty. And they were. While I collected my diploma, my mother was hosting a garden luncheon in Boston with champagne, summer roses, and perfectly lit photographs posted to social media. I saved the screenshots. Some part of me already understood that one day I would need proof the cruelty had been real. I was 7 when they sent me away to live with my grandmother in coastal Maine. No screaming fight, no explanation a child could understand. Just suitcases packed too neatly, a car ride too quiet, and one polished sentence about how it would be better for everyone if I stayed with Grandma for a while. A while turned into years. Back then, my family lived in one of those old Boston houses that looked beautiful from the outside and emotionally refrigerated on the inside. Everything was curated. The right schools, the right dinner parties, the right smiles and the right photographs. My younger sister Camille fit into that world like she had been designed for it. She had my mother's face and my mother's place in every frame. I had my father's eyes, his jaw, his dark hair. And apparently, though I would not understand this until much later, I had the power to make my mother visibly uncomfortable just by existing in the same room. My grandmother, Margaret Hale, never poisoned me against them. She never had to. She simply loved me so completely that the difference between real love and polite neglect became impossible to miss. She packed my lunches, sat through every school recital, and clapped like I was performing at Carnegie Hall even when I was just one nervous girl in the back row of a winter choir concert. I learned early that if I wanted anything, I would have to earn it myself. By 16, I was working weekends and applying for scholarships. By 18, I had a full academic package and a one-way ticket toward a life my family did not help create. I studied data science and healthcare systems. I built my path through discipline, stubbornness, and a private promise that no one would ever get to call me disposable again. My graduation was supposed to be the moment they saw what I had done without them. Instead, it became one more humiliation I had to survive in public. I mailed the invitation months in advance. I followed up. I lowered my expectations enough to hope for the bare minimum. What I got was worse than silence, because silence at least leaves room for doubt. I moved on. I worked. I turned every ounce of rejection into momentum. By 32, I had built a company, an analytics platform designed to flag suspicious hospital billing patterns. It grew faster than I ever expected. Insurers wanted it. Compliance firms wanted it. Then a larger firm came in with an acquisition offer so aggressive I laughed the first time I read it. I negotiated, signed, and watched the numbers hit my account in stages so large they almost looked fictional. 3 weeks before my mother called with a sugary little invitation to a family meeting, my grandmother died. She had been the only place in my life that ever felt steady. I stayed behind after the funeral to go through her house, because I could not stand the idea of strangers boxing up the rooms that had held me together. In the back of her bedroom closet, tucked inside an old cedar chest, I found a thick envelope with my name in her handwriting. Inside was a photograph of my mother in her 20s, standing far too close to a man who was definitely not my father. There was a typed note from my grandmother warning me not to trust sudden kindness from family members who had spent decades proving I meant nothing to them. And there was a business card for a private investigator named Ethan Cross. On the back, in my grandmother's small, careful script, she had written, "If they come back, start here." They came back 48 hours after an article about my company exit circulated through business media. My mother called sounding almost tender. She had never sounded tender with me in my life. She asked how I was. She called me sweetheart. She said there would be a family meeting at the house in Boston. I said too late, way too late. Then I hung up. 10 minutes later my father texted, saying they wanted to discuss honoring my grandmother's legacy. I already knew it was about money before I walked in. I just did not yet know how dirty the rest of it was. The house looked more polished than I remembered. New landscaping, fresh paint, the kind of place that whispers stability even when it is built on lies. My mother greeted me like we were close. My father shook my hand like I was a donor he hoped not to lose. Camille hugged me with the awkward caution of someone who knew she had always benefited from my exclusion, but had never once been forced to say it out loud. Then my father opened a leather folder and slid it across the table. Inside was a fully designed proposal for something called the Mercer Legacy Foundation, which would honor my grandmother by supporting overlooked students from fractured homes. It used all the right language: opportunity, dignity, educational access, resilience. My grandmother would have loved the mission. That was the first thing that made me sick. Because Camille was on salary. My mother had a consulting stipend. 2 outside vendors were listed at rates high enough to make me narrow my eyes. The launch budget was bloated. The oversight structure was weak. And at the bottom of the final page was the number they wanted from me: $300,000 as a founding family contribution. My mother rested her hand over mine and said they thought this could finally bring us back together as a family. That was when I understood the real insult. They did not come back because they loved me. They came back because I had become useful. I smiled, nodded, told them I would review everything carefully. Then I drove back to Maine, pulled out the card my grandmother had left me, and called Ethan Cross before the sun went down. Ethan did not waste words. He looked through the foundation documents and said if my instincts were already telling me something stank, they were probably being conservative. That was the beginning. The foundation was registered legally, which meant they were not stupid enough to run something cartoonishly fake. That was almost worse. Real paperwork, a real tax application in progress, real branding. But when I started tracing the vendors, things bent in ways that should have been straight. A strategic consulting firm tied to an old friend of my mother's had no meaningful track record. A marketing agency had a polished website, but an address that led to shared office space used by dozens of shell entities. Camille's compensation was obscene for a foundation that had not yet helped a single living person. Clean fraud is never sloppy at the start. It is elegant, tax-aware, emotionally manipulative, and dressed in mission language. A week in, Ethan called and told me he had something I needed to see in person. He handed me a file with archived photographs, an old gallery program, and a name that made everything in my grandmother's envelope start to breathe. Adrian Vale, the man in the photograph. A well-known architectural photographer in Boston in the early 90s. Magnetic, talented, financially unstable, and, according to 2 people Ethan interviewed, deeply involved with my mother before her marriage. My grandmother had been suspicious for 30 years. Ethan also found something else. My parents were under financial pressure. The house had been refinanced twice. My father was nearing the end of a lucrative position. The foundation was not just greed. It was a life raft they planned to fill with my money. Still, none of that explained why I had been sent away at 7 while Camille was adored in full daylight. I arranged private legal DNA testing. I gave my own sample voluntarily. My father's came from a coffee mug he had handed me at lunch. Camille's from a preserved hairbrush retrieved during a second visit. Adrian Vale's comparison sample came from a sealed forensic reference held by an estate attorney Ethan located through legal filings. The waiting nearly broke my concentration. I kept working, kept reviewing documents, kept responding to my mother's suddenly affectionate texts with neutral one-sentence answers. Then the lab results arrived. I opened them alone in my grandmother's kitchen with both hands flat on the table because something in me already knew the floor was about to shift. My father was my biological father. Camille was not his biological daughter. Camille matched Adrian Vale. I read it 3 times. Then I sat in total silence while every memory I had ever tried to explain with simple favoritism rearranged itself into something uglier and more precise. My mother had not rejected me because I disappointed her. She rejected me because I was proof of the life she had actually chosen. My father failed to protect me because he knew exactly what was happening and still chose the version of the family that kept his marriage and his image intact. Camille had been treasured because she represented my mother's hidden loyalty. And I had been sent away the moment I started looking too much like the man who made the lie harder to hold together. When I was 7, I had asked a simple question over breakfast. Why do I look exactly like Dad, but Camille does not look like either of you? I remembered how my mother's face changed. I remembered how quiet the house was that night. I remembered my suitcase appearing the next morning. For years I thought that memory was too dramatic to trust. Now it made perfect sense. I was not removed because I was difficult. I was removed because I was observant. Meanwhile, the foundation evidence kept getting worse. Inflated projections, governance language designed to keep spending discretion entirely inside the family, and personal outreach materials already drafted to present me as a founding force whether I approved them or not. Then Ethan uncovered that a small industry publication had been fed background material painting me as cold, unstable, and greedy. My mother was building a backup story. If I refused to fund the scheme, they would tell the world I was a bitter daughter undermining a charitable effort created in her mother's name. That was the moment the whole thing crossed from insult into war. I told them I needed additional financial documentation before I released $1. My mother replied within 5 minutes asking why I was making everything difficult. I requested contracts, vendor breakdowns, salary justification, and draft bylaws reflecting actual independent oversight. What came back was incomplete. Dates were inconsistent. Line items did not reconcile. I told them I would not release any funds until an outside forensic review was complete. That was when the masks came off. My mother called me ungrateful. My father said I was embarrassing the family. Camille accused me of making everything about old wounds. I recorded every call. I kept every email. I saved every voicemail. Then an article appeared. It did not name me a criminal. People with money and social training are usually too polished for that. Instead, it framed me as a brilliant but volatile founder whose personal instability had complicated a family charitable initiative. Within 72 hours, 2 consulting conversations went cold. A healthcare system I had been advising asked to postpone contract finalization. Another client quietly reduced my involvement on a compliance project worth nearly $2 million. No one said the article was the reason. No one had to. Reputation damage among wealthy professionals rarely arrives with a confession. It arrives as hesitation and a sudden loss of enthusiasm from people who were excited to know you last week. Then fabricated emails began circulating from an address close enough to mine to mislead anyone glancing quickly. The messages implied I had threatened to expose private family matters unless certain financial arrangements were made. The language was clumsy and melodramatic and unlike anything I would ever write. But that did not matter. What mattered was that they existed long enough to be forwarded and whispered about in conversations I was not in the room to correct. My attorney Dana Whitlock entered the picture, looked at the materials, and said this was no longer a family conflict. It was fraud, defamation, and fabricated evidence. She had me stop engaging directly, route everything through preserved channels, and begin assembling a litigation file thorough enough to survive public scrutiny. Ethan kept digging. The fake email domain linked to a service purchased through an account connected to someone in my mother's orbit. A public relations consultant had been placing background talking points with one publication after another. My mother was not improvising. She was running a reputation containment strategy against her own daughter. The direct financial loss crossed $2 million in projected work within a month. I wanted to scream. But anger is expensive when the other side is hoping you become reckless. So I did the opposite. I got colder. I cataloged everything. Then Dana uncovered the mistake that would break my mother wide open. In a filing prepared to threaten me with legal action, they attached copies of the fake emails as authentic evidence of coercion. They did not just circulate lies privately. They submitted manipulated materials in a context where forensic review could destroy them. My mother, in her panic, had done what arrogant people do when they have been winning too long. She assumed her performance would hold up under examination. She forgot who she was dealing with. I had built my entire adult life around examining what other people hoped no one would look at closely. I told Dana to file everything. Not part of it. The soft version. Everything. The pretrial hearing took place on a gray morning in Boston. My mother arrived in navy silk, polished as ever, as if good tailoring might still save her. My father looked 20 years older. Camille sat rigid between them, trying to appear composed and failing every time she glanced at the binders stacked in front of Dana. Dana started with the money. She laid out the foundation structure, the personal compensation, the vendor relationships, the consulting payments to insiders, and the false representation used to leverage my name and reputation. The judge asked how many scholarships had been awarded. None. How many beneficiaries had been served? None. Why had executive compensation begun before any programming existed? No coherent answer. Then Dana moved to the forged communications. She submitted metadata reports, domain registration paths, server traces, timing overlaps, and a digital forensic summary linking the manufactured emails to accounts and devices originating from within my mother's own operation. The courtroom went so still I could hear someone shifting papers 3 rows back. My mother's face changed. Not into shame. Into panic. Real panic. The kind that makes people blink too much and hold their jaw too hard because they can feel control leaving their body in real time. Then Dana asked permission to introduce evidence relevant to motive and long-standing family deception directly tied to the present fraud. The judge allowed it. That was when the DNA reports entered the record. My father did not look surprised. He looked defeated. That was somehow worse. My mother looked like she had been physically struck. Camille stared at the projected page for a full second too long before her whole body went rigid. Dana read the summary cleanly. I was Charles Mercer's biological daughter. Camille was not. Camille matched Adrian Vale. No one spoke at first. Then Camille turned to my father slowly and asked one question in a voice I barely recognized. You knew. It was not really a question. My father gave the smallest nod I have ever seen destroy another human being. Camille looked at my mother next. What left her face was not just rage. It was collapse. She had spent her whole life occupying the place I was denied, and every certainty she had built about herself was unraveling in public. My mother tried to interrupt. Dana reminded the court that the defense had already presented fabricated communications and that the foundation fraud and defamation campaign were tied to a decades-long pattern of concealment. The judge agreed. Then the final blow landed. Because my mother had submitted forged materials in a legal context where authenticity was materially relevant, the judge referred the matter for review and requested the district attorney be notified regarding possible false reporting and fraudulent submission of evidence. Camille walked out before anyone could stop her. My father remained seated like a man who had discovered that cowardice compounds interest. My mother stood to object, but her voice shook so badly that even she seemed to hear what it sounded like. There is a moment when certain people realize that charm will not work anymore. I watched that realization happen in my mother's face while officers approached after the hearing to speak with counsel about the referral. She was not dragged away screaming. Reality is often crueler than that. She simply lost altitude all at once. The poise, the certainty, the lifelong confidence that she could rearrange the truth by performing over it. Gone. Dana stood beside me in the hallway and said the words I had waited years to hear in one form or another. They cannot control this anymore. She was right. For the first time in my life, they could not rewrite what had happened. They could not exclude me from the room where the truth was spoken. They could not make me the difficult daughter, the unstable founder, the bitter outsider. They had built a lie so carefully that they forgot one thing. Lies collapse hardest when the person forced to live underneath them finally stops protecting everyone else from the sound. In the months that followed, consequences arrived the way they always do in wealthy families. Not all at once, but relentlessly. My mother took a plea once the forensic case became impossible to outrun. She was sentenced to 5 years. My father retired early before his firm's board could make the decision for him. The social world they had spent decades building evaporated faster than I thought even they deserved. Invitations stopped. Committee seats disappeared. Circles built on image never punish corruption because it is immoral. They punish it because it is embarrassing. Camille disappeared for a while. When I heard where she had gone, it was through Dana. She had left Massachusetts, stopped using Mercer socially, and rented a small apartment in Portland under the name Camille Vale. I did not know what I felt when I heard that. Pity maybe. Anger still. Recognition too. We were not equal victims. I will never pretend otherwise. But she had also been built out of the same dishonesty that had hollowed out the rest of the family. My father reached out once after the hearing and told me there had always been a trust in my name. 1.2 million, protected and waiting. He tried, in the language of late regret, to offer it as proof that he had loved me in the only cowardly way he knew how. I did not yell. By that point, rage had become too obvious a gift to hand him. I simply told him the truth. Money hidden for decades is not the same thing as showing up. Then I hung up. When the trust matured and the settlement funds cleared, I made the first decision that actually felt clean. I founded the Margaret Hale Foundation and structured it the way the Mercer Legacy Foundation had only pretended to be. Independent board, transparent governance, outside auditing, no family appointments, no vanity salaries. We funded full-ride scholarships for students from fractured families, children who were brilliant but overlooked, high-achieving but unsupported. I added a mental health stipend to every award because education changes a future, but healing changes the person who has to live inside it. Building the foundation did not erase anything, but it gave my anger a direction that did not rot me from the inside. I also built something else, though it took longer and mattered more. A chosen family. A therapist who never once asked me to be more forgiving than honest. Friends I could call without first editing myself into something easier to carry. Volunteers and board members and later some of our scholarship students who reminded me that connection feels very different when nobody is measuring your worth against what you can do for them. That was the strangest part of healing. Not the absence of pain. The absence of performance. I no longer had to be exceptional to earn a seat. I no longer had to succeed loudly enough to be noticed. I no longer had to wonder whether being loved would be revoked the second I became inconvenient. A year after the hearing, my mother was in prison. My father was alone in a smaller house with his reputation stripped down to what remained after Image stopped doing the work. Camille was rebuilding herself with a new last name. And I was living in coastal Maine in the house where my grandmother had taught me what being chosen looked like. Some nights I still sat in her kitchen and thought about the little girl I had been at 7, trying to understand why a simple question about faces had changed her entire life. I wish I could tell her earlier that the adults around her were not powerful because they were right. They were powerful because she was small, and they were willing to use that against her. I wish I could tell her that one day she would stop confusing their rejection with her value. That may be the most important thing I learned through all of it. Family is not the people who share your blood and then weaponize your silence. Family is the people who show up without asking whether you have become successful enough to deserve tenderness. Your worth is not created by parental approval. It never was. The truth did not just expose my family. It freed me from the story they had assigned me inside it. For years I was the daughter they ignored, the one sent away, the one who was supposed to accept exclusion quietly and then be grateful when they circled back for access to my success. But once I understood what I actually was to them, shame stopped sticking to me the way they had always intended it to. I was not the unwanted daughter. I was the inconvenient witness. Silence protects the architecture of abuse. Truth rearranges it. Accountability is not cruelty. Boundaries are not bitterness. Walking away from people who failed you repeatedly is not selfishness. It is sometimes the first honest act of self-respect in a life built around surviving their dishonesty. I never got the graduation day I deserved. I never got parents who looked at me with uncomplicated pride. I never got a childhood untouched by comparison and emotional exile. But I got the truth. I got my name back on my own terms. I got a life that no longer bends around waiting to be chosen by people who already made their decision. And I got to build something my grandmother would have recognized immediately as real love. Help that arrives without humiliation. Support that does not require performance. Proof for overlooked children that somebody sees them before the world teaches them to disappear. The most satisfying ending was not their collapse. It was my refusal to collapse with them. It was becoming the safe place I once needed. It was learning that being invisible in your own home is not a verdict on your lovability. It is a verdict on the people who made a child earn what should have been given freely. If you have ever felt that kind of invisibility, if you have ever been treated like your pain was inconvenient or your success was only interesting once it became useful to someone else, then hear this clearly. Their inability to love you correctly was never proof that you were unworthy. It was always proof of their limitation. You do not owe them your silence. You do not owe them your future. What you owe yourself is the life your younger self would have felt safe inside.